June 4th, 2026, 11:47 p.m. local time. Somewhere above the Black Sea, 3 separate drone formations are already in flight. No pilots, no cockpits, no margin for error. 950 kilometers away, the Krasnodar refinery is running its Friday night shift. 42 workers on the floor, cooling towers at capacity, storage tanks holding enough fuel to sustain Russian occupation forces across southern Ukraine for the better part of a month. The facility's air defense radar is active. The crew manning it has been on shift since 4 p.m. A Panzer battery commander is halfway through a thermos of cold tea. 2 radar operators are running passive sweep patterns they have run 300 times before without incident. They have no idea what is coming. And by the time they understand what is happening, the first wave will already be through. This is the story of how 4 intelligence analysts, 1 former petroleum engineer, and 11 days of obsessive targeting work changed the fuel calculus of Russia's southern occupation zone, permanently. This is how Ukraine reached 950 kilometers into Russian territory, struck one of its most protected logistical assets, and triggered a fuel rationing crisis in Crimea that Russian state media could not hide for longer than 72 hours. I'm your host at War Vector, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What you're about to hear is not a story about missiles. It is a story about patience, about the kind of targeting precision that most militaries spend decades trying to develop, and about a 5-person cell inside Ukrainian military intelligence that understood something Russian planners refused to accept. That industrial infrastructure has vulnerabilities no amount of air defense can fully protect, if you know exactly where to hit it and in what order. Stay with me, because what happens in the next sequence of strikes dismantles one of Russia's most critical southern fuel nodes in under 90 minutes. By June 2026, the war in southern Ukraine had entered what analysts were calling the logistics attrition period. Russian frontline advances had slowed across Zaporizhzhia and Kherson oblasts, not because Russian manpower had collapsed, it hadn't, but because operations were being constrained by something far more mundane: fuel. Armored vehicles burned diesel at extraordinary rates during active operations. A single T-90M tank moving at combat speed consumes roughly 3 to 4 liters per kilometer. A battalion task group executing a combined arms push across even modest distances can burn through tens of thousands of liters in a single operational day. Multiply that across a front line stretching hundreds of kilometers, and the math becomes brutal. Russia's southern fuel distribution chain ran through a relatively small number of critical nodes. The Krasnodar refinery was not simply one node among many. Ukrainian General Staff intelligence assessments, cross-referenced with commercial satellite data and corroborated by intercepted logistics communications, identified it as the primary processing hub for refined petroleum products flowing south toward Crimea and the occupation zones. Satellite imagery analysis confirmed that fuel shipments from Krasnodar accounted for an estimated 60 to 70% of refined product reaching Russian forces across the southern theater. Which weapon was deadlier in long-range infrastructure strikes? A. Modified cruise derivatives. B. Conventional artillery systems. C. Coordinated multi-wave drone strikes. Drop your answer in the comments below. We'll come back to this. Destroying that facility had been on Ukrainian targeting lists for months. The problem was not identifying it. The problem was the layered defense surrounding it. The Krasnodar refinery complex sat inside a defense envelope that Russian planners had reinforced steadily through late 2025. By January 2026, the facility was ringed by at least 2 Panzer S-1 short-range air defense batteries, with radar coverage overlapping to minimize blind spots. Longer-range S-300 coverage from a battery positioned northeast of Krasnodar city extended the theoretical intercept envelope to over 100 kilometers. Russian electronic warfare assets, specifically Krasuka-4 jamming platforms, were positioned to suppress incoming drone guidance signals along the most predictable approach corridors from the west. On paper, the refinery was protected, The GER targeting cell assigned to the problem did not think in terms of paper. The cell operated out of a facility in Kyiv that we will not name, under a classification level that Ukrainian authorities have not publicly confirmed as of this recording. What has emerged through open-source investigation, defense reporting, and careful reading of subsequent Ukrainian general staff statements is a picture of what made this group unusual: its composition. 4 intelligence analysts and 1 former petroleum engineer who had spent 15 years working in industrial facility management before the full-scale invasion. That engineer, whose name Ukrainian sources have not released, was the person who first identified the targeting sequence that made the operation viable. Here is the part that does not make sense on the surface. A refinery is a massive, hardened industrial installation, hundreds of meters of pipework, multiple storage tank farms, redundant electrical systems. Hitting a facility that large, with even a significant number of munitions, sounds like a slow degradation problem, not an acute capability collapse scenario. You bomb a refinery, you damage it, they repair it. 6 months later, it is back online. What the engineer understood, and what changed the entire operational concept, was that refined petroleum facilities do not fail uniformly. They have cascade vulnerabilities. Specific sequences of damage can cause a refinery to shut down catastrophically and quickly, in ways that take months rather than weeks to reverse. Because the damage is not to the pipes and tanks themselves, but to the enabling infrastructure that makes the entire system function. The cooling infrastructure, the backup power generation, and the tank manifold systems that control fuel flow between storage and distribution. Destroy those 3 things in the right sequence, and you do not damage a refinery. You shut it down, completely, within hours. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes of this story destroys Russia's primary southern fuel node for months. The cell spent 11 days building the strike package. This is not a figure of speech. 11 consecutive days, working from commercial satellite imagery, sourced through providers that Ukrainian intelligence had developed working relationships with across 2024 and 2025. The imagery gave them facility layout confirmation. It gave them cooling tower positioning, generator building footprints, and tank farm manifold infrastructure that was partially visible from above. But it was not enough. The imagery showed them what the facility looked like. It did not tell them what the facility's operational rhythms were. When were cooling systems running at maximum load? When were generators cycling? When were emergency response crews at minimum strength? The defector changed that. Ukrainian intelligence had in custody an individual with previous employment inside the Russian industrial energy sector, not at Krasnodar specifically, but at a comparable facility in the Volga region. The debrief lasted 3 sessions. Most of what the defector provided was general operational knowledge about Russian refinery standard procedures, shift change schedules, emergency response protocols, the standard positioning of fire suppression crews during off-peak hours, the generator startup sequences that kicked in automatically when primary power feeds were interrupted. One detail from that debrief shaped the entire timing of the operation. Russian industrial facilities operating under wartime security protocols, which Krasnodar had been since early 2022, run their maximum emergency response crew rotations during daylight hours. The logic is simple. Daylight allows faster visual assessment of damage, faster coordination of repair crews, faster communication with local civil defense authorities. Nighttime emergency response at a major industrial facility is, by Russian internal doctrine, a significantly reduced capability scenario. Hit the facility in the right sequence at night, and the emergency response crews arriving at the site of the first strike would be walking into the footprint of the second strike, 40 minutes later. The engineer drew the targeting sequence on a whiteboard. The analysts built the strike package around it. How many storage tank manifolds did the strike package ultimately target? A, 4, B, 7, C, 11. The answer is coming at the end. Keep watching. The weather window they needed was narrow. Low cloud cover over Russian territory sufficient to degrade optical tracking of incoming systems, but not so severe as to interfere with drone navigation. The meteorological analysis the cell was working from, sourced through a combination of European weather modeling services and Ukrainian military meteorological assets, identified a 2 to 3 night window in early June 2026. The first viable night was June 4th. They had been ready since June 2nd. When the forecast confirmed the window, the launch authorization moved up the chain inside GUR in under 6 hours. By 9 p.m. on June 4th, the operational elements were active. The three-wave strike structure had been developed in close coordination between the GUR targeting cell and Aero-Razvidka, the Ukrainian volunteer drone engineering organization that had become, by 2026, one of the most technically capable non-state aerospace development entities in the world. What Aero-Razvidka had built, in collaboration with Ukrainian defense industry partners, was a series of modified long-range strike platforms that combined extended endurance profiles with navigational architectures capable of operating under significant electronic warfare pressure. The first wave consisted of 8 modified Aero-Razvidka strike drones, long-range variants with enhanced fuel capacity and reduced radar cross-section compared to earlier platforms. These were not precision munitions in the conventional sense. Their warheads were sized and positioned specifically to address large, fixed industrial infrastructure, the cooling towers, at the approach altitude selected for this mission. These platforms presented a radar signature that Russian Pantsir operators would classify as consistent with smaller commercial or agricultural drone types, not the threat profile that triggers immediate maximum alert response. This was deliberate. The cell had studied Russian air defense operator behavior patterns from previous intercept engagements. Russian radar operators, particularly during late-night shifts, apply threat classification logic that prioritizes targets matching known strike system profiles. Small, slow, low-altitude signatures receive different, slower, classification treatment. By the time the Krasnodar facility's Pantsir operators had elevated their threat classification on the incoming signatures, the first wave was inside the minimum engagement envelope for optimal intercept. What strikes me about this targeting approach, the way the cell weaponized Russian threat classification habits against the defenders, is that it represents something more than tactical cleverness. It reflects a genuine shift in how Ukrainian military intelligence thinks about strike operations. This is not the doctrine of a military fighting defensively. This is the doctrine of a military that has spent 4 years studying its opponent, down to the behavioral level of individual radar operators on night shift. That transformation has happened faster than almost anyone predicted in February 2022. The first wave struck the cooling infrastructure at 11:51 p.m. The Krasnodar refinery's primary cooling towers sat in the northwestern quadrant of the facility, adjacent to the main processing train. The cooling system was the circulatory system of the refinery's continuous distillation process. Interrupt cooling, and the temperatures inside the processing columns rise beyond safe operating parameters within minutes. The refinery's automated safety systems do exactly what they are designed to do. They shut the processing equipment down. 3 of the 8 first-wave drones reached their targets. 1 was intercepted by Pantsir fire. 4 were jammed and deviated from their approach corridors. 1 experienced a navigation fault and did not reach the target area. 3 hits on the cooling infrastructure. Enough. The refinery's automated safety shutdown initiated at 11:54 p.m., 3 minutes after the first impacts. Alarms across the facility. The shift manager on duty initiating emergency protocols. Emergency fire response crews mobilizing. Workers who had been monitoring instrument panels 10 minutes ago were now being directed toward muster points in the facility's southeastern corner, moving through a facility transitioning from routine operations to controlled emergency status, with the kind of organized urgency that Russian industrial emergency training had drilled into them for decades. And the Pantsir operators, now fully alert, saturating the airspace around the facility with search radar. They were looking west. The threat had come from the northwest. The second wave was coming from the northeast. This was the structural insight that defined the operation. Russian air defense systems protecting fixed sites are optimized for threat envelopes along the most likely approach corridors. In Krasnodar's case, corridors from Ukrainian-controlled territory to the west and northwest. A threat arriving from the northeast required the Pantsir systems to reorient. Radar repositioning takes time. Fire control handoff takes time. The second wave, 6 drones targeting the backup generator building and the primary electrical switchgear infrastructure, arrived at 12:09 a.m. on June 5th. 4 penetrated. 2 were intercepted. The generator building took direct hits from 2 warheads. The switchgear infrastructure, a smaller target, harder to hit, but the one the engineer had identified as the critical node, took 1 confirmed hit and 1 near miss that the cell would later assess as sufficient based on the cascading effects observed. With primary cooling down and backup power compromised, the refinery was dark. Not metaphorically, literally dark. Emergency lighting on battery backup only. Fire suppression systems running on reduced capacity. Emergency crews on site, working in conditions significantly worse than anything their night shift protocols were designed for. The third wave launched at 12:17 a.m. Here is where the targeting sequence becomes, in the engineer's own framework, a problem of human behavior rather than physics. When emergency crews arrive at an industrial facility that has experienced external attack, they follow specific protocols. They move toward the damaged infrastructure. They set up around it. They begin assessment and suppression work. In the absence of any signal that additional strikes are incoming, and the Pantsir operators, having engaged 2 waves, believed the attack was complete, emergency crews at Krasnodar were concentrated around the cooling tower damage site and the generator building. The third wave targeted the storage tank manifolds. 7 Neptune derivative cruise munitions, modified for precision terminal guidance against specific infrastructure aim points, rather than the naval targeting profiles for which the Neptune family had originally been developed. These were not Neptune anti-ship missiles. They were Neptune-derived platforms adapted, over 18 months of Ukrainian defense industry development work, into a general-purpose long-range precision strike capability. Range, in excess of 900 kilometers, with the fuel load configurations used for this mission. Warhead, shaped charge penetrator, optimized for above-ground fuel storage infrastructure. Terminal guidance, a combined inertial optical approach that the electronic warfare assets at Krasnodar had not been optimized to defeat, because it did not rely on the GPS signal frequencies that the Krasuka 4 platforms were configured to jam. Ukraine does not just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. Subscribe to War Vector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what is happening in Ukraine right now is rewriting every doctrine textbook that existed before 2022. 5 of the 7 Neptune derivative munitions reached their targets. The storage tank manifolds, the network of pipes, valves, and transfer infrastructure connecting the refinery's processing output to its storage capacity, were struck across multiple points simultaneously at 12:31 a.m. The first tank fire ignited at 12:34 a.m. The second followed at 12:38 a.m. The third at 12:41 a.m. By 12:50 a.m. on June 5, 2026, Russian emergency services responding to the Krasnodar refinery were dealing with a cascading industrial fire across a facility that had simultaneously lost its primary processing capability, its backup power infrastructure, and now had fuel storage burning at multiple points. This was not a manageable emergency. This was a facility that had been, in operational terms, comprehensively destroyed. Russian state media issued an initial denial of any significant damage at approximately 6 a.m. on June 5th. The statement described a minor incident involving drone activity in the Krasnodar region, which was addressed by air defense forces. No mention of the refinery specifically. The satellite imagery told a different story. Commercial satellite passes over the Krasnodar region on June 6th and June 7th showed thermal signatures and visual confirmation of ongoing fires at the refinery complex. The thermal bloom visible in the June 6th pass covered an area consistent with at least 3 simultaneous tank fires burning at high temperature. By June 8th, 72 hours after the strike, 3 storage tanks were still burning. The fire suppression efforts visible in the imagery were concentrated on preventing the fires from spreading to adjacent tank farms, rather than any serious attempt to extinguish the primary burn sites. You do not fight tank fires quickly. You fight them slowly, carefully, and with enormous quantities of specialized foam that Russian emergency services in the Krasnodar region did not have pre-positioned in sufficient quantities for an event of this scale. The GER targeting cell, working from the same commercial satellite feeds they had used to build the strike package, confirmed the battle damage assessment on the morning of June 7th. The cooling towers, destroyed. Minimum repair timeline, 4 to 6 months. The generator and switchgear infrastructure, severely damaged. Minimum repair timeline, 6 to 8 weeks for partial restoration. The storage tank manifolds, 3 tanks completely destroyed. Manifold piping disrupted across the primary transfer network. Minimum repair timeline for full operational restoration, 3 to 4 months, assuming replacement parts were available in the Russian supply chain, which, given Western sanctions and the state of Russian industrial procurement in mid-2026, was not a given. Here is the take that will probably get us some pushback. The real failure here was not tactical. It was not the Pantsir operators who were overwhelmed. It was not the radar crews who misclassified the first wave. The real failure was at the strategic level of Russian critical infrastructure protection. Russia had 42 months from February 2022 to recognize that its strategic logistics infrastructure deep inside Russian territory was within realistic range of an increasingly capable Ukrainian strike program. The decision-makers who chose not to harden the manifold infrastructure at Krasnodar, who did not pre-position adequate emergency suppression capacity, who did not invest in the kind of multi-vector air defense integration that would have given the Pantsir systems more effective northeast sector coverage, made a choice. That choice had consequences. And those consequences are now being measured in liters of diesel per day, not reaching Russian occupation forces in Crimea. If you believe tactics win wars, type war vector in the comments. What would you have done differently, as the Russian facility commander responsible for Krasnodar's protection, in the 42 months you had to prepare? The intercepted logistics communications that Ukrainian intelligence later released to select defense journalists told the story in plain terms. The messages, dated between June 5th and June 8th, showed Russian Southern Theater logistics officers attempting to reroute fuel supply chains to compensate for the Krasnodar shutdown. The options available were grim. The next nearest refinery, capable of supplying comparable product volumes, was the Volgograd facility, over 600 kilometers from Crimea by road, involving supply routes that crossed significantly more exposed terrain and required substantially more transport assets than the pre-strike Krasnodar to Crimea pipeline arrangement. One message, dated June 6th at approximately 2 p.m. and assessed by Ukrainian signals intelligence as originating from a Russian Southern Military District Logistics Command element, read, in translation, as follows: Krasnodar output is 0. Do not wait for restoration timeline. Assume 3 to 4 months minimum. We are requesting emergency authorization for expanded Volgograd draw. Crimea consumption rates are not compatible with current alternative supply capacity. Immediate rationing authorization is required. Rationing authorization came within 48 hours. A second intercepted message, dated June 7th and assessed as originating from a lower-level fuel depot command in the northern Crimea zone, was more blunt. In translation, we have received no resupply since June 4th. Current reserve is sufficient for 9 days, at reduced operational tempo. Armored elements are being told to minimize movement. We need clarity on when Volgograd routing becomes active. 9 days. That was the buffer standing between Russian armored operations in southern Crimea and a complete halt in fuel-intensive activity. 9 days, written in plain language by a logistics officer who either did not know the message might be intercepted or no longer cared. By June 11th, 1 week after the strike, Ukrainian monitoring of Russian-controlled Crimean social media and commercial intelligence sources confirmed what the intercepted logistics message had anticipated. Fuel rationing for civilian and commercial users was being implemented across Crimea. Military consumers were being prioritized, which meant the civilian rationing was a direct window into the scale of the military fuel supply problem. You ration civilians when military consumption is already being rationed informally. The numbers were telling. There is a line in one of the post-strike Russian logistics assessments released to journalists covering this story. A line that reads almost like a textbook definition of strategic consequence. It says, in translation, current fuel reserves in southern occupation zone are sufficient for normal operational tempo for approximately 11 to 15 days. Reduced tempo operations, extending reserves to 32 to 40 days. Recommendation: operational pause in fuel-intensive sectors, pending supply restoration. An operational pause in fuel-intensive sectors. That is what a 5-person targeting cell in Kyiv achieved in 11 days of satellite imagery analysis, 1 defector debrief, and 90 minutes of coordinated strike execution. Will Russia close this infrastructure vulnerability in the next 12 months? Or will Ukrainian long-range strike capability stay ahead of Russian hardening efforts? Comment yes or no. The tactical lesson of the Krasnodar strike is not really about drones. It is not about Neptune derivative cruise munitions or Aerorozvidka's technical engineering achievements, though those achievements are genuinely significant. The lesson is about the primacy of targeting over firepower. Ukraine did not win this operation because it had more weapons than the Russian air defense system could handle. In terms of raw intercept numbers, the Russian systems performed reasonably well. They stopped a majority of the first wave. They stopped 2 of the 6 second-wave platforms. They neutralized 2 of the 7 third-wave munitions. They could not stop what they could not anticipate, because the sequencing, the approach corridors, the timing, and the specific aim points had been chosen by people who understood the target better than the people defending it. The answer to the quiz from earlier: the strike package targeted 7 storage tank manifold systems at the Krasnodar facility. 5 Neptune derivative munitions reached their targets, destroying or disabling infrastructure across the tank farm transfer network. 3 storage tanks ignited. By the satellite imagery assessment on June 8th, all 3 were still burning. Real tactics, real consequences. War vector. Was the 3-wave sequential approach the right tactical choice? Or would a simultaneous multi-vector strike have been more effective? Could the Russian air defense network, properly integrated for multi-sector threat response, have prevented this outcome? And what would you have done in the position of that GUR targeting cell? 11 days, 1 weather window, and 1 chance to get the sequence exactly right. These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that defense planners on both sides of this conflict are working through right now, in classified environments, drawing exactly the lessons that this operation made unavoidable. The Krasnodar refinery is quiet now. The fires are out. But the cooling towers are still rubble. The generator building is still collapsed. And 3 tank farm positions are empty craters, in satellite imagery, that anyone with a commercial subscription can examine for themselves. Silent evidence that modern long-range strike warfare punishes gaps in industrial defense planning without mercy and without warning. Subscribe to War Vector, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Stay vigilant.